94 bottles of beer on the wall, 94 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 93 bottles of beer on the wall, 93 bottles of beer on the wall, 93 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 92 bottles of beer on the wall, 92 bottles of beer on the wall, 92 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 91 bottles of beer on the wall, 91 bottles of beer on the wall, 91 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 90 bottles of beer on the wall, 89 bottles of beer on the wall, 90 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 89 bottles of beer on the wall, 89 bottles of beer on the wall, 89 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 86 bottles of beer on the wall, 88 bottles of beer on the wall, 88 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 87 bottles of beer on the wall, 87 bottles of beer on the wall, 87 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 86 bottles of beer on the wall, 86 bottles of beer on the wall, 85 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 85 bottles of beer on the wall, 85 bottles of beer on the wall, 85 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 94 bottles of beer on the wall, 84 bottles of beer on the wall, 84 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 83 bottles of beer on the wall, 83 bottles of beer on the wall, 83 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 82 bottles of beer on the wall, 82 bottles of beer on the wall, 82 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 81 bottles of beer on the wall, 25 minutes, 81 bottles of beer on the wall, 81 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 80 bottles of beer on the wall, 26 minutes, 80 bottles of beer on the wall, 80 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 60 bottles of beer. 79 bottles of beer, 79 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 78 bottles of beer on the wall, 78 bottles of beer on the wall, 78 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 78 bottles of beer on the wall, 77 bottles of beer on the wall, 77 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 76 bottles of beer on the wall, 76 bottles of beer on the wall, 76 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 75 bottles of beer on the wall, 75 bottles of beer on the wall, 75 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 74 bottles of beer on the wall, 74 bottles of beer on the wall, 74 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 73 bottles of beer on the wall, 73 bottles of beer on the wall, 73 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 72 bottles of beer on the wall, 72 bottles of beer on the wall, 72 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 71 bottles of beer on the wall, 71 bottles of beer on the wall, 71 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 70 bottles of beer on the wall, 70 bottles of beer on the wall, 70 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 60 bottles of beer on the wall, 69 bottles of beer on the wall, 69 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 68 bottles of beer on the wall, 68 bottles of beer on the wall, 68 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 67 bottles of beer on the wall, 67 bottles of beer on the wall, 67 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 67 bottles of beer on the wall, 66 bottles of beer on the wall, 66 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 65 bottles of beer on the wall, 64 bottles of beer on the wall, 64 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 64 bottles of beer on the wall, 64 bottles of beer on the wall, 64 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 63 bottles of beer on the wall, 63 bottles of beer on the wall, 63 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 62 bottles of beer on the wall, 62 bottles of beer on the wall, 62 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 61 bottles of beer on the wall, 61 bottles of beer on the wall, 61 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 60 bottles of beer on the wall, 60 bottles of beer on the wall, 60 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 60 bottles of beer on the wall, 59 bottles of beer on the wall, 59 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 58 bottles of beer on the wall, 58 bottles of beer on the wall, 58 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 57 bottles of beer on the wall, 57 bottles of beer on the wall, 57 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 56 bottles of beer on the wall, 56 bottles of beer on the wall, 56 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 55 bottles of beer on the wall, 55 bottles of beer on the wall, 55 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 54 bottles of beer on the wall, 54 bottles of beer on the wall, 54 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 53 bottles of beer on the wall, 53 bottles of beer on the wall, 33 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 52 bottles of beer on the wall, 52 bottles of beer on the wall, 52 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 51 bottles of beer on the wall, 51 bottles of beer on the wall, 51 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 50 bottles of beer on the wall, 50 bottles of beer on the wall, 50 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 49 bottles of beer on the wall, 49 bottles of beer on the wall, 49 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 49 bottles of beer on the wall, 30 minutes. Bottles of beer on the wall, 50 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 37 bottles of beer on the wall, 47 bottles of beer on the wall, 70 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 46 bottles of beer on the wall, 46 bottles of beer on the wall, 46 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 44 bottles of beer on the wall, 44 bottles of beer on the wall, 44 bottles of beer. You take one down, bottles of beer on the wall, 44 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 43 bottles of beer on the wall, 43 bottles of beer on the wall, 43 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 42 bottles of beer on the wall, 42 bottles of beer on the wall, 42 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 41 bottles of beer on the wall, 41 bottles of beer on the wall, 41 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 40 bottles of beer on the wall, 40 bottles of beer on the wall, 40 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 39 bottles of beer on the wall, 39 bottles of beer on the wall, 39 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 39 bottles of beer on the wall, 39 bottles of beer on the wall, 39 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 38 bottles of beer on the wall, 38 bottles of beer on the wall, 38 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 37 bottles of beer on the wall, 37 bottles of beer on the wall, 35 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 36 bottles of beer on the wall, 36 bottles of beer on the wall, 36 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 35 bottles of beer on the wall, 35 bottles of beer on the wall, 35 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 34 bottles of beer on the wall, 32 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 33 bottles of beer on the wall, 33 bottles of beer on the wall, 33 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 32 bottles of beer on the wall, 32 bottles of beer on the wall, 32 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 31 bottles of beer on the wall, 31 bottles of beer on the wall, 31 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 30 bottles of beer on the wall, 30 bottles of beer on the wall, 30 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 29 bottles of beer on the wall, 29 bottles of beer on the wall, 29 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 28 bottles of beer on the wall, 28 bottles of beer on the wall, 28 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 27 bottles of beer on the wall, 27 bottles of beer on the wall, 27 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 26 bottles of beer on the wall, 26 bottles of beer on the wall, 26 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 25 bottles of beer on the wall, 25 bottles of beer on the wall, 25 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 24 bottles of beer on the wall, 24 bottles of beer on the wall, 24 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 23 bottles of beer on the wall, 23 bottles of beer on the wall, 23 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 22 bottles of beer on the wall, 22 bottles of beer on the wall, 22 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 21 bottles of beer on the wall, 21 bottles of beer on the wall, 21 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 20 bottles of beer on the wall, 20 bottles of beer on the wall, 20 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 19 bottles of beer on the wall, 19 bottles of beer on the wall, 19 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 18 bottles of beer on the wall, 18 bottles of beer on the wall, 18 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 17 bottles of beer on the wall, 17 bottles of beer on the wall, 17 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 16 bottles of beer on the wall, 16 bottles of beer on the wall, 16 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 15 bottles of beer on the wall, 15 bottles of beer on the wall, 15 bottles of beer. Take one down, pass it around, 14 bottles of beer on the wall, 14 bottles of beer on the wall, 14 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around, 13 bottles of beer on the wall, 13 bottles of beer on the wall, 13 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 12 bottles of beer on the wall. 12 bottles of beer on the wall. 12 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 11 bottles of beer on the wall. 11 bottles of beer on the wall. 11 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 10 bottles of beer on the wall. 10 bottles of beer on the wall. 10 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 9 bottles of beer on the wall. 9 bottles of beer on the wall. 9 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 8 bottles of beer on the wall. 8 bottles of beer on the wall. 8 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 7 bottles of beer on the wall. 7 bottles of beer on the wall. 7 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 6 bottles of beer on the wall. 6 bottles of beer on the wall. 6 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 5 bottles of beer on the wall. 5 bottles of beer on the wall. 5 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 4 bottles of beer on the wall. 4 bottles of beer on the wall. 4 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 3 bottles of beer on the wall. 3 bottles of beer on the wall. 3 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 2 bottles of beer on the wall. 2 bottles of beer on the wall. 2 bottles of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 1 bottle of beer on the wall. 1 bottle of beer on the wall. 1 bottle of beer. You take one down, pass it around. 0 bottles of beer on the wall. No!